When I met Fred and Betty last night, Fred said that I was larger than I look like on YouTube, and I'll warn those of you that only see me on your computers. I am 6'2", and I'm big enough that grass doesn't grow on my front lawn just from the shade. So, but you have not lived until you've had to sit and listen to me and Dan Goodwin tell stories about our Christmas 2016 trip to deliver winter camping gear to the protesters at Standing Rock, North Dakota. The Dakota Access Pipeline, being built through Sioux Reservation land and over the Missouri River, was a threat to both the water supply of millions of people and a violation of the sovereignty of the Sioux tribe. I had been outraged by the abuses of local law enforcement against the protesters, and I was determined to do something to help. But when I heard that the police had blockaded a number of protesters on a bridge, this was the camp as it was when Dan and I arrived, covered in snow from a blizzard, but there was a bridge right at the edge that went across the river where they were trying to build the pipeline. And the police had barricaded a couple of hundred protesters on the bridge so they couldn't get off of it, and then in sub-zero weather had hosed them down with fire hoses and kept them out there in those freezing conditions. That was the day I decided that I was going. And so it was Christmas morning when Dan and I jumped into my SUV and started the trip up there. Driving into a North Dakota blizzard is somewhat more heroic than I thought it was going to be. It took us 3 days to get there, and one of the days that we were on the road for 9 hours and only covered 100 miles because there was literally zero visibility. You just inched along down the road. Tribal elders had ordered the protesters to leave the camp in the severe weather. But when we arrived, there were still a couple of hundred stalwart folk remaining in those impossible circumstances. The blizzard had collapsed several of the teepees and makeshift buildings. I had just fallen on our sidewalk back here and broken my right arm just before we went up there, so I wasn't much use for manual labor. But we hadn't been there for 60 seconds before an elderly Indian woman told Dan to grab a snow shovel and come shovel the snow away from her teepee. And that was pretty much Dan's experience the whole time he was there. He was impelled into manual labor. It was my honor to get to meet Chase Iron Eyes, who I think in 21st century America is as close to Martin Luther King as we get. And I was able to present him with the financial support that we had raised before Dan and I went up there. But it was not a universally good experience. The single largest problem on the camp for several months when thousands of people had been there was that there was just an inordinate number of women who were raped during the protest. There was a lot of theft, and though drugs and alcohol were forbidden on the camp, it was there. Of course, it was not only Native Americans who were there. The protest had drawn celebrities and bleeding heart liberals like us. It had also drawn opportunists, con artists. Didn't take us very long to figure out who was who. I even met a young Palestinian woman who had grown up in territorial protests in Palestine, and she came to America to be a part of supporting the Sioux in their protests. There were a number of wonderful people there, but there were a lot of criminals and con artists. And I'll say I didn't meet any other ministers, but I'm getting used to that. But it wasn't just the people who were drawn to the camp who had dubious moral qualities. There were serious problems among the Indian population as well. This goes to the complication we've always had in understanding the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Most of what we know about Indians, unless you grew up near a reservation, is based on TV shows and movies, and you can assume that 100% of that is wrong. Even most of what those of us who feel like we have some education in things like the Trail of Tears. Most of what we were told was wrong. There is no singular Native American culture or spirituality or even ecology. From the Inuit Eskimo populations near the polar north all the way to the Mapuche of southern Argentina, there are hundreds of tribes and languages and histories. So anytime someone wants to talk to you about Native American spirituality, what you need to hear them doing is confessing that they are completely uneducated idiots. There is no Native American spirituality because there are 1,000 Native American spiritualities. While there were written languages among the indigenous of South America, it doesn't seem like there was any in what we call North America. You understand, North America, Central America, and South America are European designations. Those are not indigenous peoples' designations. The tribes move smoothly around those borders. But when you try to talk about Indian culture, you have to be aware of pre-Columbian, before they were influenced so much by European cultures, and you have to think about post-colonizations. Indian culture was always in evolution, was always changing, and they were surprisingly open to innovation. That Indian traditions of farming and what have you, they rapidly changed. We think of Indians on horseback. Well, they didn't have horses when Columbus got here. The whole aspect of Native American culture began to change when there was exchanges between North America and Northern Europe. Foods as well. In fact, you could almost say that the indigenous caused the bubonic plague in Northern Europe, because with the advent of potatoes and corn that they sent to Europeans, there was a huge population explosion in Europe that they were not ready, sewage-wise and other reasons, to deal with that growth in population, which brought about the plagues. We brought smallpox to them. They sent us potatoes and corn. Both turned out to be bad deals as cultures work out. Many Native Americans do not now want to be called Indians or even Indigenous or First Nation people. They prefer to be called by their tribes, because a Sioux and a Cherokee is not the same thing. Their tribes can be as different as being English is from being Croat. There's not a single Europe. There's not a single Asia or Africa. There's not a single Indian culture or character or language or religion. Now, we know of no indigenous tribes that were entirely hunter-gatherers. We tend to get the impression that there were. It's not true. Everything we know about indigenous people, all the way from the Eskimos down to Argentina, was that they had at least some agricultural practices. They were in one way or another tethered to a particular land and territory. And in many ways, they were much better at agriculture than some of the first European colonizers. Europeans learned a lot about agriculture from the Native Americans. Columbus had just one advantage over the Indians that he first encountered on the islands of the Caribbean. They had better weapons. Columbus, in his journal, wrote regarding his first meeting with the islanders, this is Columbus's own words, "They neither carry nor know anything of arms, for I showed them swords, and they took them by the blade and cut themselves through ignorance." Their lack of metal weapons left them vulnerable to the ravages of the Europeans. The reason why Elizabeth Warren and most of we white folks, if you do those silly DNA tests, and it'll tell you that you're 1 or 2% Native American, is because there were tens of thousands of young Indian women that were captured in the Americas and taken to Europe as sex slaves. So we brought our indigenous DNA with us when we crossed the Atlantic to come to the Americas. Europeans who eventually colonized the Americas also did intermarry, but we started out with 1 or 2% Native American DNA. So honestly, folks, there is no way to successfully polish this turd. Columbus spoke in his journal about bringing Christianity to the Americas, but what he brought was disease. and slavery, exploitation, violence, and it turned into genocide. People have migrated for all of human history. Invasion, conquest, colonization, it's all been part of that. In fact, I find the whole DNA craze to be quite ironically narcissistic. Folks, I can save you a little bit of money. You are from Africa. Everyone is from Africa. All humans, through invasion, through conquest, through migration, through colonization, left Africa at some point. And yet, we are all pink on the inside. Race itself is a construct of language more than it is of biology. But America was built on a concept of racial, religious, and cultural superiority. And that narcissistic assumption was enforced and imposed through superior weapons. America has two original sins: the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans. Both were predicated on the assumption of some kind of superiority, largely based on race, though not always. Sometimes it was based on English culture, and sometimes it was based on religion. But still, there was an assumption that we were not obligated to treat either Indians or blacks as being fully human. It's such a horrible sin that it becomes difficult to talk about, because you either buy into it, as racists either openly or unconsciously do. I don't think that Donald Trump or my older brother or your crazy uncle that you've got to spend Thanksgiving with, I don't think they would put on their ID, "I'm a racist." There's very few people that would say it. They simply are that, unconsciously, without having made a decision. They unconsciously are racist. But the rest of us oftentimes feel so guilty about it, it's as if we should apologize for being white. And there's not much that makes sense about apologizing for a circumstance of birth. We liberals oftentimes sound like self-flagellating zealots who are so full of self-loathing that we've lost contact with reality. Now, I'm talking about all of this because tomorrow is still a banking holiday called Columbus Day, and I'm just here to tell you, I've already reached one of the conclusions I would like for you to go home with. There should not be a Columbus Day holiday. There should not be a statue. There should not be any kind of tribute to a man that history records as being a jerk on a level of Adolf Hitler, except that Columbus was more Hitlerish than Hitler was. Hitler may be responsible for the death of 6 million Jews. Columbus, in one way or another, is directly responsible for the deaths of 90 million indigenous peoples. So we should change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day or First Nations Day and begin to get real about our history and our present-day dubious ethical response to the presence of the survivors of America's First Nations. It's important to note, though, in all fairness, that Columbus Day didn't even become a national holiday until 1937. For the first 160 years of our nation's existence, Columbus didn't rate a national holiday. But in the early part of the 20th century, there were about 4 million Italians who immigrated to the United States. And it was at a period of time in the United States when there was terrible xenophobic resistance and prejudice to Italian migration. So Columbus, as an Italian, had his reputation polished to give Italians a claim to having found the Americas. So that ironically, this statue of Columbus in Columbus Circle in New York City is placed in a place where Columbus never was, nor was he ever close to it. He never set foot on the North American continent. He was in the islands. He landed in the Caribbean. But this statue was placed in New York City because that was where Italian immigrants were suffering the go back where you came from racism that Trump now applies to Latinos and to black Africans. Now, Italians have other people they can be awfully proud of. I mean, they could You can have an Italian Heritage Day and talk about inventors and artists and business people that you can hang your heritage celebrations on, but Columbus, men and women, needs to become a footnote in history. Similarly, and this is totally for free, I'm just talking about monuments, I can't help but mention it, but this monument to our Confederate dead that has stood on the courthouse lawn in my hometown of Glasgow, Kentucky since 1905 has virtually nothing to do with all the people who died in the Civil War that was over 40 years before that monument was erected. It was raised by white people as a warning to black people that even though the white folks had lost the war in the South, their fundamentalist racist views were unchanged. As proof of that, a couple of years ago, I wrote an editorial for my hometown paper suggesting that they move this bronze statue to a nearby Civil War cemetery, and within an hour of the newspaper posting that online, I had more than 70 rather violent responses from the people that I went to school with and grew up around, who assured me that should I ever return to Glasgow, that I would face certain violent retribution. And they're safe. I have no desire to return to Glasgow. But all I'm pointing out is that an awful lot of monuments are not what they present themselves as being. This Confederate monument, and most Confederate monuments, had everything to do with quashing the civil rights movement among black people and very little to do with the Civil War. And the statues to Columbus have very little to do with an Italian sailor who managed to accidentally end up in the Americas. It has a lot to do with cultural prides. But it's important that we start out to let indigenous people start to be just people. They were not savages, but they also were not noble environmentalists. They were not always peace-loving, egalitarian, generous, and good. They often attacked, robbed, and raped their neighboring tribal members. Some would, in the West, would drive 100 bison off of a cliff to harvest 3 or 4 of them. They burned forests to open farmland or to foster hunting. And many indigenous peoples practiced slavery even before encountering European colonizers. They would enslave members of rival tribes. And once we brought African slavery to this continent, many native tribes joined in. The most notable of which was the Choctaw chief, Greenwood LaFleur, who had a 15,000-acre plantation in Mississippi where he kept more than 400 African slaves, more than George Washington kept at Mount Vernon. I'd love to be able to say that the victims of our nation's 2 original sins, Native Americans and African slaves, were natural allies who worked together to fight off the oppression of European colonizers. But the sad fact is that there does not appear to be a scrap of evidence that that ever happened. In fact, many tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. Apparently, racism can be an infectious disease. Native American historian Paul Chatt-Smith says, the Cherokee had a very successful trade in guns and slaves in the 17th and 18th centuries, and as the Southern slavery grew, they were not at all reluctant to take part in it. People who live near reservations often think of Indians only in association with casinos and crime, the crime that always comes with unemployment, drug and alcohol addiction, and poor education systems. White liberals are often equally racist when they portray all Native Americans as being some kind of New Age forest bunnies. But my point is this: the First Nations of the Americas do not have to be paragons of environmental virtue, nor must they be magically connected to nature in order for us to come to a sane and balanced view that they have been historically victimized by colonization, that their numbers have been decimated by genocide, diseases, land theft, and discrimination. And while they have issues of their own, it is time for us to take our boot off their throats and give them the respect and the opportunities for education and business that would allow them to forge a decent life in the 21st century. Columbus was one influential character in history. We cannot undo the migration of people from the East into the Americas, but we can recognize that while Columbus had some virtues, his sins are such that we should never praise him or publicly honor him. And while Indians are not saints, they are people, and it's time that we started to treat them like people more than they are movie props or the names of our sports teams. And finally, as for me, my next pipeline protest will be in Florida. The moral issues are the same, but I have learned that my old bones infinitely prefer palm trees to blizzards. Still, we must let the indigenous peoples of the world arise.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.